Imagine submitting a time card to your boss claiming you worked um, 203 hours yesterday.
Right, like yesterday. Not for the month, not for the week.
Exactly, in a single 24-hour day. And then imagine that instead of firing you on the spot, the government just cuts you a check without asking a single question.
It sounds like a bad joke, honestly.
It really does. But before we get into how something like that is even mathematically possible, do me a quick favor. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and turn on that notification bell.
Yeah, it's really the best way to ensure you never miss our updates.
Speaking of updates, here is the mandatory 15-second brief on the Morton Stevens versus OpenAI matter. Just to be absolutely clear, it is still not a lawsuit.
Right, we are in a voluntary quiet period right now.
Exactly. At Martin's request, we are idling the release of any new public info, just hoping for settlement in the background. Now, we do not know if any actual progress or discussion is underway right now.
But the dead man's switch hasn't been activated.
Right, so Martin is physically and legally safe. Okay, with that out of the way, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a staggering scale of fraud that unfolded over the past 2 decades in the state of Minnesota.
And we have a massive stack of source material for this one, including court documents, Department of Justice press releases, and investigative journalism.
Yeah, these sources detail everything from a $3.7 billion corporate Ponzi scheme to a $250 million pandemic meal fraud. So our mission today is to look under the hood. We want to understand the exact mechanisms these massive schemes use to just, operate in plain sight.
And also how the perpetrators justified the theft in their own minds.
Right. And what happens when local bureaucratic failure triggers a massive national political earthquake?
It really is a remarkable timeline because we're looking at 2 distinctly different eras of fraud here. The perpetrators operate in completely different spheres. I mean, one is in high-level corporate finance, and the other is in grassroots social services.
But they both share a core methodology, right?
Exactly. They identified systems built on trust,
Yeah.
and they systematically dismantled the oversight mechanisms meant to protect that trust.
Let's start by looking at the corporate side of things with a man named Tom Petters. In the early 2000s, Petters was this incredibly charismatic, widely respected businessman in Minnesota.
Oh yeah, he built a massive corporate empire.
He really did. He eventually acquired legacy brands that everyone listening probably knows, like Fingerhut, Polaroid, and Sun Country Airlines. But the foundation of that entire empire was a $3.7 billion Ponzi scheme.
Which is just a wild amount of money.
It is. And to understand the mechanics of how he pulled this off, you really have to look at his background. He practically grew up in retail. He started working at his great-grandfather's store when he was just 10 years old.
And by 15, he was already running his own electronics mail order business out of a downtown office.
Right. So he possessed a very deep instinctual understanding of retail supply chains. And that knowledge led him to create a company called Petters Companies, Inc., or PCI.
And PCI operated in a very specific kind of gray area of the retail world known as diverting.
Yeah, I want to spend a second on diverting, because understanding this business model is really the only way the rest of the fraud makes sense. So let's say you have a massive discount retailer like Costco, and they want to sell high-end name brand electronics.
Like Sony flat-screen TVs.
Exactly. But big manufacturers like Sony absolutely refuse to sell directly to Costco. Because if a discount warehouse undercuts the retail price of their premium TV, it ruins the market value of that TV everywhere else.
So Petters steps in as the middleman.
Right. CDI buys the TVs and sells them to Costco. But to hide the supply trail from the manufacturer, PCI uses fake company names and entirely fictitious purchase orders.
Which is where things start getting really shady.
Yeah, I picture this like a corporate shell game. The cups are these newly registered fake companies, and the ball is a massive shipment of flat-screen TVs. You just keep sliding the cups around the table so the original manufacturer completely loses track of where the ball is actually going.
And because they were moving those cups around every single day, the act of falsifying documents just became entirely normalized within their corporate culture.
It was just part of the job.
Exactly.
Mm.
Petters and his core team, specifically his trusted associates, Deanna Coleman and Bob White, they spent their days generating fake purchase orders and fake vendor names just to conduct their standard day-to-day diverting business.
And psychologically, that creates a super dangerous environment. When your legitimate business model already requires you to forge documents to trick manufacturers, the ethical boundaries are basically non-existent.
Right, so eventually, Petters realized he didn't actually need the physical shipment of TVs to keep playing the game.
Wow, so they just stopped buying the actual product.
Yeah, they started taking money from hedge funds and private investors, promising them a huge return to finance these massive shipments of consumer goods. But the goods stop existing entirely.
It's just paper.
Just paper. They use fake purchase orders to secure real capital, and then they use that new capital to pay off the older investors.
So it is the literal textbook definition of a Ponzi scheme, just dressed up in the language of corporate logistics.
Exactly. And when you look at the court documents, Petter's defense mechanism relied heavily on the psychology of plausible deniability.
What do you mean by that?
Well, he claimed he was simply too busy running these massive, legitimate brands to know what was happening in the background. I mean, he was launching Polaroid's new Z&K printing technology. He was managing an airline.
So he's saying I'm the big picture guy.
Right. He argued that he was a visionary, and he had no idea that Deanna Coleman and Bob White were in the back room entirely fabricating the documents that kept the whole empire afloat.
But that narrative completely shatters in September 2008, right? Deanna Coleman walks into the FBI, confesses to the whole scheme, and agrees to wear a wire.
Yeah, she records Petters, the empire collapses, and he is eventually handed a 50-year prison sentence.
Now, 50 years for a man his age is essentially a life sentence. But the court documents show he didn't just accept his fate. I mean, how does someone staring down a 50-year sentence try to con the system one last time?
It's pretty wild. In 2013, he filed a desperate motion in federal court, specifically under a statute known as 28 U.S.C. Section 2255.
Okay, what is that in plain English?
In plain terms, this is a legal maneuver where a prisoner claims their sentence is invalid because their constitutional rights were violated. Petters claimed ineffective assistance of counsel.
So he blamed his lawyers.
Yes, he argued that his 3 defense attorneys never told him about a 30-year plea deal that the government had allegedly offered before his trial.
Oh, I see.
His argument was that if his lawyers had simply told him about the offer, he would have taken it, effectively shaving 2 decades off his sentence.
I'm reading through Judge Richard H. Kyle's response to this motion right now, and it is just a blistering denial. The judge noted that the so-called offer wasn't even a formal contract.
Right, it was just talk.
Yeah, it was just a preliminary oral discussion about a potential sentencing cap. But the judge didn't stop there. He pointed directly to Petters' own behavior during the trial.
Because Petters was incredibly emotional on the stand, right?
Exactly. On the witness stand, Petters had shed what the judge explicitly called crocodile tears, swearing up and down that he had absolutely no intent to defraud anyone.
Oh, wow.
The judge highlighted that Petters fundamentally refused to admit guilt at any point. Therefore, there was zero logical chance he would have ever stood up in court and accepted a 30-year plea deal.
Because accepting that deal would have required a full public confession of his crimes.
Right. It was just a final display of hubris. But the fallout did yield some justice for the people he stole from. By 2021, the Department of Justice and the appointed receiver managed to successfully recover and distribute over $722 million back to Petters' victims.
Which is a significant recovery for a Ponzi scheme.
It is. So Petters showed us how someone can use corporate complexity and supply chain mechanics to hide a multi-billion-dollar lie. But it turns out you don't actually need a boardroom to steal hundreds of millions of dollars.
No, you don't. Sometimes you just need a global crisis and a nonprofit tax status.
Which brings us to Aimee Bock and the Feeding Our Future scandal. Now, this is a very different type of fraud.
Very different. Aimee Bock is a 45-year-old white woman who founded a nonprofit in Minnesota in 2016. The stated mission of the organization was to help feed underprivileged children.
Sounds like a great cause.
Right. And for the first few years, they operated relatively quietly. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And in response to the crisis, the federal government issued waivers allowing parents to take meals home since schools and community centers were closed.
And almost overnight, Feeding Our Future's billings to the state absolutely skyrocket. I mean, they go from $3.4 million in 2019 to nearly $200 million in 2021.
And that money was definitely not going to hungry children.
No. A massive network of perpetrators, mostly from the Somali American community who had set up distribution sites under Bock's nonprofit umbrella, they were systematically draining the funds.
They were submitting totally fabricated lists of children.
And entirely fake invoices for food that was never purchased. It is estimated they stole $250 million, and federal authorities later indicated that the final number could actually top $350 million.
Just staggering amounts of cash.
Yeah, and they used this money to buy luxury cars, massive real estate portfolios, and they even funneled money overseas. But hold on, I need to stop here.
What's up?
I mean, I can understand a state bureaucracy missing a few fake invoices buried in a stack of paperwork. But we are talking about a jump from $3 million to $200 million in just 2 years. If you're listening to this and screaming at your dashboard wondering where the auditors were, you aren't alone.
Oh, I totally get it.
If the state saw meal claims jumping from $3 million to $200 million, why didn't they just shut off the faucet immediately? How is there not a hard-coded limit in the state's accounting system that automatically freezes the account the second it crosses a 5,000% increase?
Well, the reality is the system did flag it. The Minnesota Department of Education, or MDE, noticed these impossible numbers, and they actually tried to pause the payments to investigate.
Okay, so they did try to stop it.
They did. But Aimee Bock understood exactly how to weaponize the legal system and the political climate against the state regulators. When the state paused the funding, Bock sued them.
She sued the state. For what?
She publicly claimed that the Department of Education was intentionally discriminating against her minority partners.
So she uses the threat of a civil rights lawsuit to force the state to keep the cash flowing.
Precisely. You really have to view this through the lens of the time. This was occurring during a period of intense nationwide racial tension and heightened scrutiny on government actions.
Right, everyone was on edge.
The state regulators were terrified of entering costly litigation, and they were absolutely terrified of the public relations nightmare of being labeled racist in the press.
Wow.
A senior employee of the state's Office of the Legislative Auditor later reviewed this sequence of events and explicitly called the Department of Education's response a systemic failure. Out of fear, the state essentially caved to the pressure, dropped their hold, and resumed paying out millions of dollars to these fraudulent sites.
That is wild. And her defense strategy during her trial was just as staggering. She tried to frame herself as a modern-day Robin Hood.
Yeah, she essentially blamed the state regulators, arguing that if there was fraud happening under her nonprofit, the state should have done a better job of stopping it.
Which is just a complete deflection of accountability, but the jury saw right through it, obviously. In May 2026, Aimee Bock was sentenced to over 41 years in prison in order to pay $240 million in restitution.
And out of 79 indicted suspects connected to this specific network, 65 have already been found guilty.
But, the terrifying thing about the Feeding Our Future case isn't just the sheer amount of money stolen. It is that it acted like a stress test for the entire state's oversight apparatus, and the system completely broke.
It really did. Once investigators actually started lifting the rocks and looking closely at how social service funds were being distributed, they found this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right. The Feeding Our Future scandal was like opening a Pandora's box. The entire safety net was deeply compromised.
It was a contagion of fraud.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the other programs investigators audited, it is genuinely heart-wrenching.
Yeah. Take the Integrated Community Supports Program, or ICS, which is designed to provide care for adults with disabilities. Investigators found providers billing the state for 12 hours of one-on-one care a day, but the workers were only checking on the clients once.
And this wasn't just financial theft. It had fatal consequences.
It did. It led to the tragic death of a client named Rick Clemmer, who suffered a medical emergency and died alone because no one was there to call for help, even though the state was paying a provider for full-time supervision.
It's incredibly sad. And the audacity extended into substance use disorder services as well. Investigators found that nonprofits like New Way Alliance were double billing the state by exploiting a loophole in the 30-minute billing rules.
How does that even work?
The mechanics of this are remarkably cynical. The state requires a minimum time threshold to bill for an hour of service. So these providers would offer 35 minutes of service, bill the state for a full hour, take a 10-minute break, provide another 35 minutes of service, and then bill the state for a second full hour.
It's just a constant loop of overbilling. And then you have the provider called Evergreen, who was caught billing 203 hours of service for a single employee in one single day.
That is just mathematically impossible.
Again, forget human auditors for a second. In any basic off-the-shelf corporate time tracking software, if you enter a number higher than 24 for daily hours, the system throws a hard error. How does a state government system process a 203-hour daily timesheet and physically cut the check?
It comes down to decentralized, legacy government technology combined with a mandate for rapid payouts.
So they just wanted to get the money out the door.
Exactly. These systems were originally designed to prioritize getting money to providers quickly, operating on an honor system where the data entered by the nonprofit is assumed to be accurate. There were no cross-referencing algorithms to flag chronological impossibilities.
It was a total free-for-all. Investigators also found $21.1 million billed for fake autism therapy under the EIDBI program. Clinics were literally paying families a $1,500 kickback just to enroll their children.
And then the clinic would bill the government for expensive therapy sessions that were never actually provided to the kids.
And this environment, this widespread systemic vulnerability, is the powder keg that suddenly exploded onto the national political stage.
Right. In December 2025, a YouTuber named Nick Shirley and a right-wing lobbyist named David Hodge released a video claiming to expose empty Somali-run daycares in Minnesota that were allegedly defrauding the government.
And that video went massively viral, accumulating over 135 million views on Twitter alone.
It did.
But, when a video gets 135 million views, the actual facts often get trampled by the outrage. What do the source investigations actually say about the claims in that video?
Well, multiple media and state investigations reviewed the footage and the claims. And the consensus in the source material is that the video contained limited evidence to support its broader accusations.
Okay, so it was making some pretty big leaps.
It was. It also included outright false claims. For instance, Hawk falsely stated in the video that the Minnesota state flag had been recently redesigned to match the national flag of Somalia.
Which is just factually untrue.
Right. Furthermore, when state authorities and journalists subsequently investigated the specific daycare sites that Shirley visited and filmed, they found no evidence of fraud at those particular locations.
But the truth of that specific video didn't really matter at that point, because the public trust was already so eroded by the real scandals like Feeding Our Future and the autism kickbacks.
Exactly. The political fallout from this viral moment was an absolute earthquake. It is a textbook example of how a localized issue of bureaucratic failure can escalate into a deeply polarized national crisis.
So what exactly happened next?
Looking strictly at the factual timeline and the sources, the reactions from both the federal and state governments were intense. The incoming Trump administration utilized the growing controversy to unilaterally freeze all federal child care payments to the state of Minnesota.
Wow, just froze everything.
Yeah. And alongside the financial freeze, the federal government launched ICE crackdowns in the area under the operational name Metro Surge. These sweeps were aimed specifically at Somali immigrants in the state, and tragically, this heightened federal enforcement resulted in 2 highly publicized deaths of individuals during the operations.
How did the state government respond to that federal intervention?
At the state level, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz fiercely criticized the federal response. He publicly condemned the freezing of funds and the ICE raids, characterizing the federal actions as scapegoating rooted in white supremacy.
But he was getting hit from both sides, right?
He was. Governor Walz was simultaneously facing intense, bipartisan criticism at home for his own administration's handling of the fraud crisis. The pressure was immense. He publicly admitted that his administration had developed a culture of being a little too trusting.
Which is a massive understatement when someone is billing 203 hours in a day.
To say the least. So, in response to the crisis, Walz set up an anti-fraud task force, and his administration paused 14 different Medicaid programs to conduct emergency audits.
But the political damage was already done.
It was. The sheer weight of the scandals, the systemic failures, and the resulting national spotlight took a heavy political toll. Ultimately, it forced Governor Walz to make a surprising announcement. He withdrew his 2026 bid for a 3rd gubernatorial term, stating he needed to focus entirely on fixing the state's oversight systems rather than running a political campaign.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Why does this matter? Why should you care about a diverted shipment of Sony TVs in 2008 or a viral daycare video in 2025?
It's a fair question.
It's because, at the end of the day, whether it is a charismatic, jet-setting CEO in a tailored suit or a nonprofit founder hiding behind social justice language, fraud on this staggering scale drains the resources of everyday taxpayers.
It absolutely does.
And worse, it steals directly from the most vulnerable members of our society. It takes food out of the mouths of children who genuinely need meals during a pandemic, and it removes life-saving daily care from disabled adults.
And that leaves us with a critical, lingering paradox to explore.
What's that?
Well, our entire social safety net is fundamentally designed around a mathematical contradiction: efficiency in crisis relief versus security against fraud.
Meaning, if you want to help people quickly, you have to lower your guard.
Exactly. To make a system easy and fast enough for vulnerable people to access during a global emergency, you inherently make it easy for fraudsters to exploit. The system assumes that a nonprofit applying to feed children actually wants to feed children.
Which seems like a fair assumption until it isn't.
Right. But when fraudsters figure out how to weaponize society's best intentions, using the threat of bad PR, the fear of lawsuits, or accusations of discrimination as a shield to protect their crimes, are we essentially leaving the vault door wide open?
That is a great point.
How do we design a system that trusts the people who genuinely want to help while ruthlessly filtering out those who only want to help themselves?
That is the multi-million-dollar question that every bureaucracy is going to have to answer. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Before we go, please remember to like, subscribe, follow, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive. Thanks for listening.